Thank you for joining us today for this presentation on the math behind housing development in partnership with our friends at Silicon Valley at Home. My name is David Garcia, and I am the Policy Director at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, and I'll be leading this presentation. I want to thank Leslie and her team at SV at Home for their support for this work and for all the work that they do in the Bay Area. So what we'll be going over today is our analysis on what it takes to actually get housing built in Silicon Valley, which includes the cost of construction, setting rents, and financing requirements developers must work with to build projects in our area. We originally presented this work on October 11th in Los Altos, and what you're seeing now is a recording of that same information that was presented. But the genesis of this work actually began over a year ago as part of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission's CASA process, which is a blue ribbon task force tasked with developing policies to alleviate the housing crisis in the Bay Area. And as part of this task force, the Turner Center was asked to provide information on the math behind development for committee members, which we did in October of 2017. And we received very positive feedback from the committee on this work, and so we've continued to carry our analysis forward in other conversations, including this one, where we've built on this original analysis to be specific to the South Bay. One of the main reasons for pursuing this work is that there is a misunderstanding of what is driving the housing crisis in the Bay Area and California broadly. And over the past several years, we've seen costs go up dramatically across several aspects of building, such as materials, including lumber, concrete, and steel, the price of land, insurance premiums, and interest rate increases, as well as development fees. And together, these increases in cost make building housing and the subsequent rents required increasingly out of reach for the residents of California. But that's not how the issue is viewed broadly by the public. In fact, when asked, most people single out developers themselves as the reason for the housing crisis. For example, a UCLA study found that respondents are most opposed to projects when they are told that a developer is likely to profit from the construction of new housing. Moreover, a recent Mercury News survey found that respondents singled out greedy developers as the main reason for the housing crisis, even ahead of restrictive land use policies and construction costs. So given this, we know that there is often a lack of understanding about the cost to build new housing. So our goal from this presentation and our work broadly is to articulate the process by which housing gets built so the public and policymakers understand both the challenges facing those trying to build housing and how various policy goals impact this process. And that's what we'll walk through now. So to achieve this, we've developed a prototype project, which we've named Turner Terrace, to describe how housing gets built. And these are the characteristics of Turner Terrace. First, this is a market rate building, and it is being built in a premier location, so somewhere like North San Jose, on about 1 acre of land. Turner Terrace has about exactly 160 units, from studios to 1 bedrooms to 2 bedrooms, as well as a 1-to-1 parking ratio, so 1 unit per parking space. We also have about 2,000 square feet of retail on the ground floor, which is enough for a small coffee shop. And most importantly, Turner Terrace is what we call a 5/1 construction type, which includes wood frame construction over a concrete podium. This is your standard type of development typology for mid-rise projects such as Turner Terrace. It's important to note that if we were examining less dense housing such as townhomes or single-family homes, or more dense housing that requires more steel and glass, such as a high-rise, that the numbers you see in a few slides would actually be very different. We've also made a series of assumptions about Turner Terrace, which I'll walk through briefly here. So we've estimated that the land to build Turner Terrace costs about $8 million, and that was determined through sales comps in the region. We've also determined that this project doesn't need an EIR or environmental impact report as required by CEQA, and we have no demolition on site, no environmental remediation such as underground storage tanks, and no offsite infrastructure improvements. We've also assumed no exactions, by which I mean no additional costs or requirements levied on the developer as a condition of approval. We also assumed standard approval times, standard wages, and $40,000 per unit in fees required from the city where we're building Turner Terrace. We're also assuming Q2 2018 construction costs, which at the time of this recording is probably out of date as construction costs have continued to rise. So it's also rare that that a project such as Turner Terrace would have such a favorable set of assumptions, and most, if not all, projects will run into at least one or two of these requirements or challenges, which could dramatically raise the total cost to build. So knowing our project characteristics and our development assumptions, this is what it costs to build Turner Terrace. Total cost is just under $80 million. And as you can see, we've broken out this total cost by category, which I'll walk you through now. At the bottom, you see the cost for land, which includes closing costs and due diligence, such as tests. In the middle, we have by far the largest component of our cost, which is hard cost, which includes construction costs, including materials, systems, and wages, but also a 5% contingency. From there, we have fees, which is a very big variable, but we've estimated about $6.4 million in total fees, or about $40,000 per unit, as mentioned earlier. These could easily be much higher depending on the city that you're working in. Above that, we have our financing costs, which are the cost to close on the loan, soft cost contingencies, and operating reserves. Also, an important point, this category also includes a developer fee, which goes to pay for the developer's overhead during the development process. And in this case, we have budgeted about 3% of total cost for the development fee. Above that, we have the cost for consultants, and this includes the various architects, engineers, and legal and accounting professionals required. And at the very top, we have tax, title, and insurance. We've also broken down the total cost of Turner Terrace by unit, as you can see here. So now that we know how much it costs to build Turner Terrace, our next step is to get money to build the project. And by and large, this financing is not the developer's own money. A developer has to secure financing from other sources, such as debt or a loan from a bank, and equity, which is private money to cover what the bank will not give you. So we're going to walk through those financing requirements now. Important point, what we're about to walk through is a very high-level basic look at financing, and there is much more that goes into these calculations than what we are presenting, but this will give you a baseline knowledge of financing requirements. So first we'll look at debt, which again is the amount of money that we can get from a loan, such as a bank or from a financial institution. And just like if you were going to get a loan to buy a home, our bank has certain requirements that we must meet before they will be comfortable enough to lend to us. And one of those requirements is something called a debt service coverage ratio, which is the ratio between the total debt we are seeking and Turner Terrace's projected net operating income, which is the money from rents minus our expenses. So to guard against default, the bank requires us to have a certain level of NOI above our debt. This ensures that in the event that our rents are lower than anticipated or our expenses are higher than anticipated, that we still have enough cushion to continue paying back our debt. That's why a debt service coverage ratio of 1 is too risky, as depicted on the left here. Instead, in our scenario, our bank requires us to have a ratio of 1.3 in order to give us a loan. Also, a bank is not going to loan us all of the money that we need to build our project. What they will lend to us is referred to as a loan to cost. In our scenario, our bank will only loan us about 62% of the project's total cost, which means that we have just over $27 million that we need to come up with to fully finance the construction of Turner Terrace. And this $27 million will come from equity, or otherwise known as people or groups that will invest in the project. And similar to a bank, our equity partners have certain requirements they need to be comfortable enough to invest in Turner Terrace, which we refer to as their return on investment. Now, there are several ways to measure a return, But for simplicity, we're using something called the return on cost, which is a project's net operating income divided by the total project cost. Generally speaking, equity partners require a return on cost of 5.5% to be comfortable enough to invest. Now, in some places where the market is particularly strong, the return on cost may be closer to 5, whereas in weaker and riskier markets, the return on cost may be closer to 6 or 7%. But for our purposes, we're going with 5.5%. And as you can see, Turner Terrace just meets that 5.5% return on cost metric, as well as an internal rate of return of 15.7%, which, depending on the type of investor you are, may be sufficient or may be a bit too low. It's also very important to understand who these investors are and that developers compete for these dollars across a global pool of capital, and these potential capital partners need a certain return for investing in housing construction, which is much riskier than stocks or bonds. Now, of course, we have our large types of private equity investors such as Blackstone, but what most people don't recognize is that many pension funds also invest in housing, from public sector employees such as teachers to union pension funds as well. And these funds invest in real estate to pad the top ends of their portfolios to supplement their more traditional investments such as stocks and bonds. And in addition to these, there also are sovereign funds that invest in real estate as well. So again, these are almost always global funds that can invest all over the world, not just in real estate either, but in any kind of investment. So if a developer cannot meet the return requirements of these funds, they will go elsewhere. So now that we know how much it costs to build Turner Terrace and what the return requirements are to get financing, these are the rents that the project must charge to make the project feasible. And as you can see, these rents are very high, from $2,400 for a studio all the way up to $3,800 for a 2-bedroom. Now, obviously, there's only a fraction of the population in the South Bay that can actually afford these rents. In fact, less than a quarter of renters in the region make enough money, which we've measured as annual costs no greater than 30% of a household's total income, to afford a 2-bedroom at Turner Terrace. Now, before housing costs were so high to construct housing, the market used to deliver housing for people at much lower levels. But as you can see today, as a result of higher costs, the market is only able to create housing for the highest income earners. And just to reiterate, our project has a very specific and favorable set of characteristics. For example, again, we're in a premier location, such as North San Jose, as the rents that we must charge for Turner Terrace are actually at the very top end of the South Bay market. And there's only a handful of places where this is possible. Also, our 1-to-1 parking ratio and $100 per month parking rate are very rare in the South Bay, and many times you will see parking offered for free in new developments, and parking ratio is much higher than a 1-to-1. Given the math for our prototype, we know that excuse me, sorry. So given the math for a prototype, we know that even slight changes in policy can have a significant impact on whether or not Turner Terrace gets built, which is illustrated here, where you see the cumulative impacts of various policy requirements. On the left is our baseline prototype, which just meets that 5.5% return on cost. And as we layer on more and more requirements, such as a 15% on-site affordable unit requirement, or increasing development fees to $60,000 per unit, or requiring a 1.5 to 1 parking ratio, the project becomes less and less feasible. And we show this because it's important to understand the relationship between many well-intentioned policies and the feasibility of housing development. Of course, there are ways to calibrate local policies to work with the housing market in order to achieve our policy objectives, such as getting more affordable housing built in new developments. We have to make sure that the math works. So what you see here is the opposite of the previous slide, where providing offsets such as reduced fees, reduced parking, and allowing more units creates a much more favorable environment to get affordable units into Turner Terrace without impacting the financing requirements. And as you can see, this set of circumstances even gives us some room to discuss other benefits as well. So unfortunately, we oftentimes see local policies set without this type of analysis in mind. And as you can see here, it's incredibly important to get the math right. Otherwise, cities end up with no housing and none of the benefits that could have come from the approval of that housing. So to bring this full circle, as we discuss the housing crisis in California, it is imperative that we understand the process by which housing gets built. As you've seen here, the math behind development is a critical piece of any discussion on the impacts, good or bad, of our housing policies. So I want to thank again our colleagues at Silicon Valley at Home for supporting this work, and also to encourage you to follow the Turner Center as we continue our research series on the cost of building housing, as well as our other housing-related work. And you can find our work online at www.turnercenter.berkeley.edu. Thank you very much for listening.